Good morning, guys, and thank you for listening to Soul Talk on Saturday mornings. And I'm just excited to be able to present this next show for you. And we are going to be speaking in our journey of the afterlife and communication with the spirit realm. It's a kind of a series I am doing, and I'm not sure how long I'm going to be doing it, but it's going to be for a little while. And my exploration of the afterlife and communication with the spiritual world, near-death experiences, shared-death experiences. We're going to be calling them, interesting enough, the Afterlife Journals, which is kind of like what is so interesting about this topic and author that we're going to be speaking to today. His name is Frank DeMarco, and he holds something a little bit about Frank. He holds a Master's of Arts in History from the University of Iowa and a Bachelor of Arts in History from George Washington University. His work as co-founder and for 15 years chief editor of Hampton Roads Publishing Company brought him into close association with many brilliant and insightful minds, including psychics, remote viewers, channelers, and mystics, and showed him the human side of extraordinary abilities. Some of you might know that Hampton Roads Publishing is the one that published the book Conversations with God with Neil Donald Walsh. In 1992, Frank started opening up his psychic abilities and opened up a gateway voyage at the Monroe Institute in Central Virginia. Since then, he has been engaged in first-hand exploration of the nature and limits of all things psychic, especially including such areas as healing and guidance, direct access to knowledge and communication with past lives, and the integration of spiritual dimension into everyday life. His autobiographical work, Muddy Tracks, Exploring an Unsuspected Reality, describes the first stages of his discovery of the key to expanded awareness and offers pointers for those just beginning their quest in his web blog at www.hologrambooks.com, WordPress, and WordPress.com. Some of the things that he says here is that his blog, I of my own knowledge, he investigates what individuals can know firsthand about the purpose and conduct of life. He can be contacted at muddytracks@earthlink.net. And like I said, you can find him at hologrambooks.com, or his blog here is hologrambooks.com/hologrambooksblog/. So I think you're really going to enjoy this interview today, and so please hold on for Frank DeMarco. Thank you. Well, good morning, everybody, and we're back, and Frank is on the line now. And Frank, good morning. How are you doing this morning?
Good morning, Jeremy. I'm doing just well. Yourself?
I'm doing great. I've been looking forward to this interview for a while, and we talked last year about your last project, the Cosmic Internet, and that was very well received. And so I'm excited to talk about your new project that you're working on, which is about your. I'm just to say it's kind of your conversations with Ernest Hemingway, because that's what it is. And what I'm really kind of excited about is that this is talking about the afterlife. Is that kind of what I'm understanding correctly?
That's right. Not only about the afterlife, but actually it's primarily, I think, in a way, using my conversations with Hemingway as an example, is primarily designed to tell people you can do this. This is a human natural thing. Everybody can talk to the disconnected, to the discarnate. It isn't like they have to have a turban and they have to have my signature on a card, you know.
Right.
I think many people already experience it, but they blow it off as imagination. You know, I'm just making this up or something.
Yeah.
I read a newspaper article some while ago now that said that within a year of their spouse's death, 70% of the people that the Gallup organization surveyed said they felt they had communication from that person.
Right.
70%. And that's the 70% that admitted it, okay? And, of course, that happened probably usually spontaneously. But in my book and in my other books, I'm showing that you can learn to do it mostly by disabling all the doubts and the self-criticisms to allow it to come through, and then judge it later. Don't judge it ahead of time and say, well, this is probably not true.
Right. Yeah, and I do understand that. It's a good feeling. I think what some people call it stilling of the mind. You calm down all those doubts and those thoughts of this is my imagination, and you just let it start coming and pay attention. Do you think that comes with a practice?
I think actually it comes partially when people realize that it's a two-step process. That to get anything, you have to perceive and then you have to interpret. But as soon as you begin interpreting, you've stopped perceiving until you stop interpreting again. So that it's like a reciprocal action. If you begin to get something and then you decide you want to judge whether it's true or not, as soon as you start doing that, you've stopped perceiving.
Right.
And you need to do both parts of the analysis. Because if somebody were to get voices or to get information or to get knowings and never judge them, then they become a flake. You get a voice that says, put all your money on the 7th race at Hialeah on a horse named Baby Shoes.
Right.
Well, it might work, but I wouldn't bet on it. I would take the opposite side of that bet. And the opposite side of that is people who are so intent on being hard-headed and practical and not dulling themselves that they never allow themselves the moment of communication in the first place.
Right.
But I mean, and I really am very much aware that everything I'm telling you here, but we'll say it anyway for the sake of the record.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and that's interesting because it's what I was kind of very excited about actually is that I've been on this subject all year of afterlife in connection to spirit, in connection to and just paying attention and listening, and I've been doing that for many years. But it came with a shared death experience that I had with a family member this last year, and so then my connection to them, because I was so close to them in life, got that in spirit is really strong. So I didn't have a doubt, and then my training obviously of being hearing spirit anyways, and teaching myself to calm and have that practical side, and the discernment of whether one is my imagination or one is my one voice is my imagination, one is the actual spirit, and a balanced voice I would call it. So and I think that's really important. I think this subject's so important for the people that are listening and people out there searching for answers.
We're moving into another era now. I mean, I really do believe that at the end of the Mayan calendar, obviously it's not going to mean poof, bang, the end of the world. Right. But I think there's like a convenient marking place for a new way for our society to evolve. I asked the guys upstairs one time what the next step on human evolution was going to be. And they said the next step is you walk around in your bodies, but you're connected, and you are connected as you live, and you're in that step at the moment.
Right.
And so that's cool. It takes us a long time to walk, evidently.
Absolutely. Well, talk to me a little bit about the track. I guess there's 3 tracks. The book proceeds along on 3 tracks. The first is the correction of the Hemingway myth. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I know that many of my friends who have looked at some of this material that I've sent them on the internet have been surprised because they have bought the myth without ever really thinking about it, that Hemingway was just a drunk and a bully boy and a fighter who happened to be, he wrote a couple of good books, but mostly he was, sort of almost a clown. And the reality is so far from that these long series of conversations with him have shown various aspects of him. Just before you called, I was looking through the book and I was rereading his conversation about him and his father, how deeply he loved his father and how much he criticized his father, not realizing certain things, But the whole thing, it is not an apology for Hemingway, and nor does he require one. Right. But it's a showing of how many different strands of the man. Here's a man who was really a world-class sports fisherman. He actually set records, and he actually established the Sports Fishermen's Association for, I think it's marlin. Okay, he was, of course, a world-class hunter. But at the same time, this man haunted museums for paintings. He was a good collector. Well, not so much a collector, but he knew and understood modern art. He, from the time he was a boy, he knew opera. His mother, would bring there. He was well aware of classical music. He had a library. I think when he left Cuba, the library that he left was in excess of 7,500 books. And that's, of course, not every book he ever owned. So what I'm saying is he was an outdoors man and a thinker, and he participated in many levels in the world in a way that's often not appreciated. I didn't set out to do all this; it sort of happened. Right. Maybe Papa set out to do it. I don't know.
So
that was one strand of it, anyway.
Yeah, definitely. And so then going on, into the other. I mean, obviously they need to read the book to understand this, but can you kind of give a basic overview of the other two strands?
Do you remember what they are?
The second strand shows how to how communication with the non-physical proceeds, which I think we've already touched on a little bit.
Okay, and I'll talk a little bit more about that.
Okay.
And what was the third strand? I forgot.
The third strand is the most important, which depends upon the other two, provides a new model of the physical and non-physical interaction. Interesting.
Okay, all right. And in a way, you could fold both of those two together.
Absolutely.
I think that by looking over my shoulder while I learned to talk to Hemingway, the reader can see that it doesn't involve special talent so much as it involves a couple of basic attitudes, and then the ability to do it without judging it ahead of time. Now, later on, I discovered, well, the guys upstairs told me, they said, when you're in a conversation with somebody, whether it's like you and I now speaking in body, or whether either of us speaking to someone who's dead, or speaking to someone who's never had a body on earth, regardless, the minds create a temporary joint mind. And I think that is just a very, very valuable and there's a lot of stuff packed in there that needs to be thought about. A temporary joint mind, so that when I'm talking with Hemingway, I can have been watching a Star Trek video. Hemingway now has something of the experience of Star Trek, which of course didn't start till after he was dead. It also means that I can intuitively know things that he knew, that he felt, that he maybe never expressed. And then, of course, the question always becomes, well, okay, you know it, but is it true just because you know it? But that's a separate question.
Right.
Verification is always a question.
Right.
But taking that for granted for the moment, you have the ability very usually, very naturally, because we do it every day when we communicate. It's a matter, I think, of people just changing their category, and instead of saying, I can't do this without special talents, saying, this is the same as talking to anybody else, except that I have to intuit the response rather than use my ears.
I think that's actually that's a really good point. I just want to touch on that just for a second, because I think that's a message for a lot of things. We think that we're talking about the communication between physical and non-physical, but just to take it a step further, people think they can't do anything in life. A lot of they block themselves so that for what they fear. And so I've found when I'm working with individuals, even myself, my mind will start going into, I can't do that because I wasn't able to, I didn't have this or I don't have that. And it blocks us from taking that step forward to even potentially even see the possibilities. And so
there's a nice thing I like that says, a thing that's worth doing is worth doing badly.
Yeah.
And that is really, I found that very freeing,
In sales, I learned the phrase that said, fake it until you make it.
Oh, yeah. You just define business.
Well, it's an interesting thing, and some people get offended by it. Like, well, it needs to be good quality. I'm like, well, you're not saying that you're not giving good quality. You're just saying that you're pushing yourself out there to do it because you gotta learn it.
It's funny you bring that up because that was my entry into dealing with Hemingway in the first place. I had talked to him once and just thanked him for his book because at that time I didn't know much about his work and I had only read a couple of his novels, but there was one that I read over the years repeatedly. Mm-hmm. And I just, sort of said, okay, thank you, Papa. Well, Mr. Hemingway in those days. But later on, I was in England and I was traveling. And when I travel, I always haunt the bookstores because you got to have something to read in the hotel rooms, right?
Right.
And besides, there are bookstores that might be opportunities that you don't have. I came across a book called Young Hemingway by Michael Reynolds. Now, little did I realize that Michael Reynolds was a scholar here in North Carolina, right next door. And this was the first of a 5-volume series. But be that as it may, I was sitting in a hotel room in Manchester, and I'm reading about the things that Hemingway did, the pretending and the lying that he did as a young boy to try and make himself bigger than he was. And I got upset about it because I knew that one of Hemingway's real, one of his cardinal points was to not be a phony, to be real.
Right.
And so I sat down with my journal and I basically said, Mr. Hemingway, these are your values, but you certainly weren't living them here. And I was listing chapter and verse, right? And he said, well, that's quite an indictment, but I think I can answer it. And he starts talking, and what it amounted to was basically fake it until you make it. He was a young boy just out of high school. He had spent a few months in Kansas City as a reporter. He had gone to the Western Front as an ambulance driver, as a volunteer, because he had a bad eye, couldn't have gotten into the Army. He was blown up within a month, okay? So he's in the hospital with all these veterans, and he's wanting to be a veteran, and he's embarrassed because he was a Red Cross man who was in the trenches where he didn't need to be. He was a volunteer, but he was giving out chocolates to soldiers, to Italian soldiers.
Right.
And a mortar hit right in the middle of the night, and he got 226, I think it was, pieces of shrapnel in his legs. So it was not a trivial wound, but he's there among men who, some of them were heroes, I mean, some of them really were very much combat veterans, very much what he wanted to be. And he began sort of reinventing himself and telling these stories about his, he had been with this unit and that unit, and he learned carefully how to present himself as if he were a veteran. And I was taking him to task for that because there's a certain lack of integrity. And he made it clear to me, without saying it in so many words, he didn't want to go back to being basically a high school boy out of Chicago, Illinois.
Interesting.
See? Yeah. He was trying hard to find a way to escape those limitations and lead another life. And, of course, that's just the physical Hemingway. The non-physical Hemingway already knew the pattern of his life, I suppose, or at least knew what he was in the body to do.
Right.
And so... Anyway, that's a long riff on fake it till you make it.
Well,
that's basically what he started to do.
Yeah, and we kind of think about that. Isn't that how all of us learn too? We kind of get out there and it's fake it until you make it. But well,
I was never in sales.
well, I mean, and I think I can't remember a story you told me the last time I talked to you. You would. I mean, obviously, you're best known for being a publisher, and you published a lot of books. And you were an editor-in-chief, but prior to that, I think you did something else.
Well, prior to that, I did many other things. I was a computer programmer. I was worked for Congress for a couple of years. Ran for Congress when I was 28, 27 actually. Worked as a film librarian for a while. Was a newspaper reporter. I couldn't keep a job.
Yeah, so I mean so you almost switched businesses from that professions, and so each time you had to learn it. But what I'm kind of getting at here is that we as people learn based on our experiences. Sometimes we fall down, sometimes we get up, sometimes we make what we would consider to be mistakes, and then we grow from it. And so, and I think that's when we're talking about communication and paying attention to the non-physical in the physical. And I think that's the third strand here is I think it's done through trial and error.
It amounts to trust, really, in life.
Right.
When I was almost 40, I had a series of things. I had never really found my profession, and I was stuck as a computer programmer, which I had been for 6 years. And I could do the job, but I didn't enjoy it. It wasn't fulfilling. When I got my job as an editorial writer for the Virginian Pilot in February of '86, when I was just 39, I suddenly looked back and I realized the only reason I got that job was because I had qualifications, and one from here, one from here, one from here, and they were all things that at the time I thought were dead ends. And I realized it was like jumping on icebergs, on ice floes to cross a river. And I said to myself, I will never worry again about, what will happen, because I suddenly realized it was taken care of.
Yeah. Yeah, because each step of the way brought you to where you were at.
And there was no way at the time for me to see that. You live your life, and in any given moment you think, well, God, I don't know where this is going. But it goes somewhere, and there's a purpose to it.
So isn't that kind of the Hemingway path in a lot of ways when he's talking about him, looking at his life? I don't know a whole lot about him, but didn't he do the kind of the same thing?
Well, I'll tell you, I always envy somebody who knows young what he wants to be. because it took me a long time to figure it out. But Hemingway knew he was going to be a writer, and that's all he wanted to do was be a writer of fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And after the war, he arranged, after he got married, he came back to Paris in 1921. He was giving freelance articles to the Toronto Star just to make money, but he was practicing trying to become a real writer. And that is the unspoken thread in his life all the way through. But he wasn't just sitting at a desk writing. He was going out, and apparently this man had his inputs wide open all the time. He could learn like anybody's business. He would, in fact, it irritated his wife, Martha Gellhorn, when they were in China for a few months, mm-hmm. because she was always going out trying to figure out what was going on. Mm-hmm. He sat in a hotel lobby for a month talking to people at all levels, from the highest to the lowest. He came up with a strategic estimate of the situation that you can read it today, and it's still true. He even predicted that if the Japanese attacked, it would be in December of 41.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, this was like 10 months earlier. But what I'm saying is he was able to pick stuff up. He knew. And, of course, as the sensory man, it's somewhat unusual. You know, I've never said this before in just this way. Most of us tend to be either sensory or intuitive, and he had them both very well developed. He was highly intuitive, and, in fact, I would say he was in an altered state while he was writing, and he knew that. Right. In fact, I have a wonderful piece from him. Most of these, I'm going to interrupt my interruption. Most of the way that I do this is sit down in a journal and just write, and I'll ask a question, or I'll say, anybody wants to stop? Here we go. But one day, in the middle of the day, I just had the impulse to sit down in the middle of the day after I'd already talked to Hemingway in the morning, and it just came and it flowed out. And it's him about how it was when he was writing. And basically what he says is he was in an altered state and that he missed that. In fact, if you want, I could read it to you. It's a couple of pages. Absolutely. Is that all right?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, because it really is, and I can say this because I don't believe it's mine. It really is a beautiful piece of writing. All right, and you have to give me a minute so we can talk about something else while I find it. Okay. I know it's between page 151 and 199, but that doesn't help us too much. I probably ought to dog ears or something. Okay, here it is. Okay, you ready?
Yeah, definitely. Go ahead.
This was June the 7th of 2010, and in brackets I had to say, this entry came as a wonderful gift. I was moved to sit down and write in my journal, and as soon as I put pen to paper, this came through spontaneously. So here it is, 12:45 p.m. Day after day I wrote, and this is how it is. You've experienced something like it. You wake up early in the morning and you get up and you get going. You're sitting there and maybe it's coffee like you use or tea. I like tea. And it's paper and pencil and a pencil sharpener and you're living in your mind for all those hours. It isn't like you don't know you're in a room writing. It's more like a kid who's sitting in a cardboard box and he knows it's a cardboard box, but he also knows it's an airplane or a boat or a stagecoach. You're sitting there writing, you're staring out the wall or out the window, and at the same time, you're someplace else, living another life, feeling a different season's sun, maybe out in the Gulf, fishing with Santiago, or just driving down an old road you loved, or one you'd made up. And you loved that bilocation feeling without even thinking about it. In fact, if you did think about it, you'd probably think about it wrong, because you'd be wishing you were really there, whatever you were writing about, when what you really wanted was what you had, being here and there, living it, writing it. And then there was a whole different set of exercises and satisfactions when you look at the way you had described something you remembered, or something you'd made up and experienced in your mind, or something that was remembered and then reworked, or something that started out looking like it was made up but then got hooked into something from the life you'd lived. And you'd look at the words, feeling for the soft spots that had to be taken out, looking for the blank places where the words had gone dead on you, looking for the things you'd said that were good in themselves but didn't quite belong. And you'd cross out, or you'd move, or you'd reword, and maybe you'd reread it, and it still wouldn't be right. You'd have to do it again, more probing, more moving around, more listening to the echoes, listening for the dull thud instead of the bell metal ringing. And all this exercising the skill from another dimension, because it couldn't be done by logic, left you just as cold, gloating, satisfied as anything you could do in life. And you'd come out from there at noon, or wherever your schedule called for, or maybe earlier or later, depending on how your work was going. And it was turning the key on that part of your life, and you were free to be with another person and to enjoy pleasures, simple and complicated, expensive and cheap and free, pleasures strenuous or contemplative, athletic or aesthetic or gastronomic or piscatorial or anything. And underneath all the pleasure, even just reading if that's what you were doing, even just a midday nap if that's what you wanted, underneath it all was the morning's writing, the long immersion into that active, receptive country that only another artist could experience. And the days went by, silent, providing no anecdotes or additions to the Hemingway myth, not memorable in any way, except perhaps eventually in whatever manuscript they produced, and they were incomparably, indescribably sweet. Biographers don't really convey that. They may sense it, after all, they're artists themselves, but it doesn't lend itself to long description, because nothing much happens externally, and if they put in a few paragraphs like these, indicating the flavor and texture of such a part of a life, after all, they can't keep repeating it every so often, chapter by chapter, but the artist experiences it day by incomparable routine day, and his life is a delight in those times, no matter how his art makes him sweat. And then there's another thing he said. To have that deeply satisfying routine interrupted or threatened is almost more than you can bear, especially for stupid reasons, but even if for the best. What movie rights deal is going to make up for costing you that quiet ecstasy, even if only for a few days? What's it worth to have to trade living in two worlds for business dealings, or politics, or family troubles, or your own illness, or incapacity to work for some reason? It's awful, and there's no way around it. They say, he's in a good mood because his writing is going well, and they just don't really have any idea what they're talking about. Even if they've experienced something like it, it doesn't occur to them in such a way that they can translate it to others. Writing as an out-of-body experience, that's what you should call it. Another aspect to think of it, when you're spending time in that invented world, that land of imagination, of imaging, you don't want to leave it and return to the single vision world. That's like leaving the world of alcohol-induced gaiety or clarity, or let's just say sparkle, and living in a dishwater, flat, emotional nothing. But if you stay drunk, you lose it all, and if you were to stay in that double-image land, your mind half-created, half-entered, it would go dead on you. You couldn't write out of it, and then you couldn't even visit. There's a cruelty to the way life is organized. You can get by on the level easily enough, maybe. Life at half speed, the character says. But if you get highs, you're going to get lows, and an artist gets highs. First, he gets them from that territory he goes to while he's practicing his art. And then maybe he gets his highs from alcohol or cocaine, and he doesn't realize maybe that what he's doing is trying to drink away or drug away his loneliness for that country. And of course, I don't know about women artists, but it's common enough for men to find that same echo in sex, especially sex with women he loves. There's a lot of crap written about sex. I wrote my share of it. But there's something there regardless. And if you haven't experienced it, there's no telling you. And if you have, there's no telling you. All I can say is that what I'm talking about is entirely involved in romance, not just fornication. So, but enough. In the mornings, I wrote. The rest of the day, and in the evenings and in the night, I did other things. And so I kept the balance. And in those times, whenever and wherever they came, life was clear, satisfying contentment. Biographers miss all that because it isn't easily communicated and would need to be repeated every chapter. Jeremy, that just all came in one long swell swoop, they say.
That's incredible. He's talking about walking between both of his worlds. Well, in all of his worlds.
Absolutely.
And the joy that it brings him. And you know, there's so many people. Wow.
There's a lot of key to Hemingway in those few pages, because it also shows you some of his success in other times. If you think about what we think of as normal life, if you think of it this way as being like the interstices of his real life, which was when he was working, it looks different, you know.
Right.
His pleasures and his even his problems look different.
Yeah.
This was a remarkable. This went on for a couple of years. There was about a 6 or 7 or 8 week period when I talked to him every morning.
Wow.
And it was just wonderful.
And so, you know, we're coming up. We mentioned 2012 earlier. Obviously, we're kind of getting close to that time that we're all expecting. Do you think? Well, I kind of know the answer to this, but there's a lot of spiritual energy, like Hemingway, and different forms of spiritual energy coming in. The medium, or the person that's quiet enough to hear or see or listen, they're bringing that through for us. Do you think they're coming really to help us ascend this planet? I mean, that's what I feel, but I just didn't know what your take was on that. And
Well, I'm not sure what that means in some ways, because this planet is it's a wonderful garden.
Yeah.
And the physical world was created by the non-physical world for very specific reasons. As you and I talked about that last year with the cosmic internet.
Yeah.
There are things that can only be done in the physical world. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes people say, well, I want to make it a better world. And I think, well, it's good enough as it is. I like it.
Oh, yeah.
But I think the change is everybody has more access now than they did earlier. 100 years ago, I mean, they talk about the thinning of the veil, I know it's just a metaphor, but I think it's a pretty good metaphor.
Yeah.
It seems to be that common people like ourselves can do things that 100, 200 years ago only very exceptional people could do.
Right.
And therefore, I know when I was a boy, I would read about Edgar Cayce, and I thought, wow, wouldn't it be wonderful to be able to do that? And I assumed that was the kind of thing that only one person in, several million could do. And perhaps at that time it was true. Well, I'm not Edgar Cayce, and as far as I know, you aren't either. But we can, it's like playing the piano. You don't have to be Rachmaninoff in order to learn how to play.
Right.
And even if you can't play well, you can at least play chopsticks.
Absolutely.
Everybody today, as they realize that they can play chopsticks, everybody's life is going to be different. It's going to be, and I'm looking forward to this tremendously, to tell you the truth. I've been waiting for decades for this time to come around, and it is around.
I've gotten a feeling it's our level of allowing that allows us to see more. I guess the less and less we do the thinking that somebody else is special, the more and more we'll realize that we are special, but we're also the common person too.
That's right. Well, it's like that joke children's book title that says you're special just like everyone else.
Yeah.
but it really is true.
Yeah.
It just happens to be funny.
Yeah, definitely. So and I've been seeing that more and more on people around me. They're like, I just had this experience. They're like, Jeremy, I just had this experience. And when I've gone to my own book signings and people are just like, oh, I want to write a book. I feel it. I'm like, well, then do it. And there's that level of some people will say I can't because I didn't do well, or I just don't think I can. And I'm like, everybody has a book in them, or they have the potential to do it. And I say, if I could do it, anybody can write a book.
Well, when you said about allowing, you got it just right. I mean, it is the biggest blocks, maybe the only blocks that really matter, are ourselves. Every once in a while, you'll hear a story of somebody who's overcome some amazing, unbelievable handicaps to do something, and you realize, okay, the difference between him and other people is he knew he could do it, even if it didn't make sense for him to know it. He knew it.
Right.
And we can do the same thing, but it requires an act of faith. And the act of faith is, if something inside of you says, I want to do this, I can do this, maybe you ought to listen to that.
Just a tad off subject, I went and saw this movie, I guess it's based on a book, I didn't know this. It's called The Life of Pi.
I keep hearing about it. Tell me about it.
Oh, it's along the lines of what we're talking about. In this boy, he's Indian, and his dad decides that they're going to move from India to Canada because they have a better opportunity. Well, they own all these wild animals like tigers and zebras and different stuff like that. Well, the ship goes down in the Pacific in this huge storm, and he ends up on a lifeboat with a tiger, with a wild tiger, a Bengal tiger. And so he builds a raft outside of the boat and was going back and forth while the tiger is sleeping to get food. And basically feeds both of them, keeps them going, tames the tiger, and at one point when he thinks all hope is lost, there's a bunch of flying fish, I've never even heard of flying fish, that comes and like fills the boat full of food. And so it's really about this act of faith that every time you have just a tad bit of courage, that 20 seconds of courage, everything is, and you haven't lost all hope. It's right there. You're taken care of, and everything is there. So in those moments when you think you have the doubt and you step just past that doubt, everything falls into place. And I think we all experience that doubt at some level.
We do, but but not everybody experiences the practicality of faith.
Yeah.
And it sounds so woo-woo to them
Yeah.
that they think, well, you're just lucky. It's like they used to say that about Emerson, you know. Emerson was optimistic because nothing bad ever happened to them.
Yeah.
And you could say that, except he was orphaned when he was 3, and his younger brother died or his younger sister rather died when he was just a couple of years older than that. His oldest son died. You know, I mean, two of his brothers out of 3 died young and tragically. You understand what I'm saying? He didn't have a life with no sorrow. He had a tremendous amount of sorrow, but he had a life lived in faith.
Yeah.
And I don't mean Christian faith. I mean faith.
Just
I mean, not that Christian faith isn't real, but it's one variant of trusting in life.
Yeah, it's a knowing that you're going to be taken care of at some level. Mm-hmm. And so I experienced that. I was not far from where you're at. I was in Virginia Beach in September, mm-hmm. and I had this. I'm getting ready to drive home. I'd been waiting for money to come into my account so I could drive home. and I'd been on tour for 3.5 months, and I was exhausted, needless to say. And I go to have dinner at one of my favorite sushi restaurants in Virginia Beach, and as soon as I leave, the battery light comes on in my van, and I just get this strong feeling, drive straight to AutoZone. So I drive straight to AutoZone, not the one close by the sushi place, but I just go to the one over by the house in Indian River that I'm staying at. And I go to this AutoZone, and I'm just like, I'm not going to worry about this because I know I'm going to be taken care of. And my mind wanted to worry about money and all that kind of stuff. And so I get there, and then there is literally a mechanic at the AutoZone that is willing to put come to find out it's an alternator, and it's $50. He charges me $50 to install it. He does it in 30 minutes, and all in all, I think I spent just under $200. And if anybody knows anything about alternators, especially on a van, it's not cheap.
No.
So I'm like, so I'm driving home, and I'm just this what I already knew just got in that much deeper, and I thought to myself, listen, there's never a time when we're not taken care of, and you're always, even if it would have cost $800, I would have been fine.
Right. So, and the interesting thing is our lives get harder when we try to control.
Right.
If you had said, no, it doesn't make sense to go to that one. There's one right here. I'll do this one.
Right.
That would have been perfectly logical, perfectly sensible, and nobody could argue that. And you'd have missed the battery.
Right.
But you knew inside.
Right.
You're connected. I
had to I had to follow that and pay attention and honor it. And I think, and so that path, and I think we talked about this last year, but because I think we were just starting on this project, and I know you've been talking to Hemingway for a while, even before your last book, before the Cosmic Internet, if I remember correctly. Yeah. So, I mean, how did that start off? How did your conversations with him? I mean, was there?
Well, I've been talking to individuals. I've been talking to what I call the guys upstairs since '89. Mm-hmm. But I began really talking specifically to individuals in 2005. I won't go into it, but that was in another book I wrote. And I was having breakfast with a friend one morning, and I told her how much I really loved Islands in the Stream, which is Hemingway's first posthumous book. My father-in-law had given that to me back in 1970, and every so often I would reread it. I just loved it. It's really a story about a man and his love for his sons, basically. But she looked at me and she said, "Well, have you told him?" And I thought, duh. So the next time I was ready to talk, I tried to contact him, and I knew that he had committed suicide. So I thought he might need assistance. As you may know, the Monroe Institute, where I got a lot of my training, has a program that teaches you to help people who are disoriented or are lost on the other side. That often happens after suicide. So my first thought was, can I help you? And he knew, again, the joint mind thing, although I didn't have that concept then. He knew what I meant. And he said, no, that's not necessary. I knew what I was doing. It's just my life had run out. And then we began talking. In fact, I introduced him to my father, who had died some years before, because I knew Dad had liked him anyway. And there was some similarity in them somehow. I mean, my father was not a writer. He was a farmer. But then, you know what I'm saying? Temperamentally, there was some connect there. And I just thought they would like each other. And it seemed like they did. Then nothing much happened for more than a year. And then, as I said, I was in England, and I got that Young Hemingway book. And after that, nothing much happened until about 2009. And then just, It's the story of my life in a nutshell. One thing led to another.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like the guy said about the fuse and the dynamite.
Yeah.
So when at this point, I can't remember when I began having continual sessions with him, but it was just so enjoyable and so satisfying. I didn't want to stop. And so what happened is at the time I had maybe 3 of his books. Now I have more than 80. All of his books and a lot of books about him and some of the scholarship and all that. And it's just, the more I learned about his books, about his life, the more questions I had. So I would go and I would say, you know, can we talk about this? Mm-hmm. What about you and Scott Fitzgerald? You know, what about this, that, and the other? How about Perkins? And it just one thing kept leading to another. I never intended this to be a biography of him, and it is not. But it has a lot of insights, I think, into who he really was and what was going on behind him. And there's a good deal of things in there explaining stuff about his writing that I don't think most people know. You know, it's maybe you don't know, but Hemingway has a lot of short stories, many of which are taught in classes, and people don't get them. They don't understand what they're about.
Right.
One of my friends is she's retired now, but she was a teacher of English literature in Denmark. Wow. And she was following what I was doing, and she told me about Indian Camp, which is a story of his, and some of the misconceptions that her students have. And they wanted to know one specific thing, or she wanted to know, you know, on their behalf. Did this mean this, or did it mean that? And so I went in and talked to her. And she said, no, it didn't mean either one. You're not getting it right. And what it turned out, and I'll tell you what, Jeremy, this was an amazement to me. Hemingway, you may know, Hemingway's prose was very much stripped down. He took all the bells and whistles and flowers out of language to try and return it to its original vitality. Right. People know that. But there's another aspect to it that I had never heard, and that is his iceberg theory, which I did know of, where he said, leave out stuff, and if you know what you're leaving out, it'll work. The reader will get it. Right. Well, I knew that. What I didn't know was, in order to get some of Hemingway's stuff, you have to sort of co-create it with the author, and if you can't do it, you're not going to understand the story and just be puzzled by it. If you do get it, then you're in another level. That is a whole different level of writing and a whole different level of reading than your ordinary novel. And it tells me that Hemingway scholarship still has a long way to go. They may think they know who he was and what he did, and there's a whole other level that only metaphysically oriented people are going to get it first. Wow. Because we're used to dealing with things, how shall I say, they're sort of, it isn't that they're illogical, but they don't have anything to do with logic one way or the other. They're sort of just intuitive, and that's what you're doing. You have to use your intuitive sense on some of those stories, or you're not going to get it. It turns out, and in fact, this is in the book. There's one section there where I said to him, I don't understand this story. And he said, okay, go ahead and list every element in the story. It's a 3-page story. So I filled like 2 pages of legal pad because the whole thing was so dense. And I had all these elements. I listed them all out. And he said, okay, now. And then as we looked at it, what it turned out to be, but it took him probably took him 10 journal pages of mine. It took him 2 or 3 printed pages to get me to the point. He didn't tell me, but all of a sudden I got it. The whole thing was about it's from a boy's point of view. It's what it's like to be a boy and to sense things, but not understand what you're sensing. That's the story that ends with sitting there in the back of the boat. Nick knew that he would never die. Hmm. And when you look at it, the whole thing, that whole story, is young Nick Adams, experiencing the whole story, watching everything that goes on, totally misunderstanding it or not understanding it at all because he's too young. He doesn't know. Well, as I say, those literature courses didn't get it. They didn't understand it. They were trying to make it into something that it wasn't.
They're trying to pick it apart in logic with their logical side, and they can't feel it.
Yes, like one of the things was that well, I don't want to go into it because it's too long, but that's exactly what they did, and they don't have the key to it. It's just like what I'm doing here is reminding people that we can talk to people on the other side if we can get out of our own way. Once you have the key, I don't have anything to say about what you're going to get, and I don't need to have. I want to have. but I've given you the key, you know. And now that, and of course other people have given the keys over the years, obviously.
Yeah.
With that key to Hemingway, anybody can read Hemingway and get him, because every time you're confused, there's your key. You say, okay, now what is he doing here? What is it that I need to intuit out of this? And you'll get there.
Right.
Remarkable, though. I mean, the man wrote most of his stuff in the 20s and 30s.
Yeah.
You know, heck, a hell of a long time ago.
That was, well, we're coming up on 100 years. You know,
yeah.
The 20s.
Well, he was born in 1899, so that was, 113 years ago.
Wow. Wow.
He's already been dead more than 50.
That's incredible.
It is.
That is incredible. And when you think about that time, that era, it was just a different, well...
I can remember part of that era.
What's that?
I said I can remember part of that era.
Oh.
I'm 66. I'm older than Papa ever got.
You know, my mother had a patient that was, when she was in hospice, that was 108, and she was born in 1890-something. And I remember she's like, just the stories that she tells, and I'm like, well, that's incredible. But to kind of touch on the subject, I really like it because, you know, and I know you know this, there's a lot of spiritual texts that, well, almost every spiritual text, if you don't read it and kind of get involved with it, experience it, it doesn't come alive for you.
That's right. That's right. You're the half of it that has to be in there.
Yeah.
If you're not in it, it's just words.
Yeah, absolutely. So what are some? I mean, he's taught us a lot here, just in the conversation we've had here. He's taught us about, you know, that the story. I have to tell you, when you were reading, my mind was going on its own journey, and just the energy that what you were talking about was literally taking me out and experiencing my own story going on and just enjoying it. And so, I mean, you know, when that happens, I'm like, you know, I'm in, and I think that's a good feeling to have. So he's already taught us that, you know, we can all honestly create these different stories going on, but I call them kind of like realms in our psyche, so to speak.
Oh, what in our psyche?
I call them realms in our psyche. You know, when he's writing a story, yes. You know, he's experiencing everything, and you know, he was writing it out. That's like a realm going on in our psyche. You know, it's just an experience that we're having. And you know, some people say that's the imagination, but it's really an experience.
Well, they're not wrong, but they're limiting that word too much. People now think that imagination means fantasy, but there's another sense of imagination in which it's a tool of perception. It's the imaginal world to begin with.
Right.
And that tool of perception is before language, and it's before logic, so it can teach us things that anything else that we've learned can't, because they can. I mean, you know, if you're speaking English, you're experiencing the world different, in a different manner than if you spoke Spanish or Urdu or Turkish or something. Every language structures the world and reflects the structure of the world.
Right.
Well, if you're into something that's before language, then you're into something that's before structure, and you can get deeper perceptions. I know you know this, but it's for the sake of our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and this is the basis of why we do this, so that we can get the listeners, and you know, when they read the book, they can really experience something on a different level. I think that's kind of what I was getting at, and we were talking about one of the reasons why Hemingway is talking to you. Not only has he taught you and helped you open up, but he's now coming in through you. He's the two of you as a team are helping opening up other people.
That was the hope. Years ago, many years ago, the guys upstairs told me something that at the time I didn't understand at all, but I'm beginning to. They said anybody who reads a book is in direct connection not only to the person who wrote the book, but to everybody else who read the book.
Yeah.
Now think about that in terms of maybe Plato, who's been going on for 2,500 years so far, or Hemingway, who's been so widely read. What a terrific potential network that creates. Yeah. And we just have to learn to walk the network.
Yeah. I think that's the basis of one of the reasons why I like to read. Is because not only am I reading it, especially if the author autographs it, I can feel their energy and what they were feeling. And then when I go through their words, I really get to experience what they were experiencing. And you pick up their wisdom or their experience. And it's an incredible feeling. Nonfiction or fiction, you know, it doesn't really matter.
I think, too, I hadn't thought this before, but as I'm thinking about what you said, as I was reading Hemingway's piece there, your mind went off on its own. And I think if you were to read something by him or by anybody and allow your mind to sort of daydream at the same time, like two tracks, I think that would bring something that you couldn't get ordinarily too.
Absolutely.
Not sure quite what, but I think that might be a valuable thing to do. I may try it.
Yeah, but the reason why I'm bringing this up because us talking, and I'm hoping this will do this for the listeners. I've been experiencing reading several books over the last few months, and then I just realized recently I'm reading a book by a gentleman named Dr. Moody, and I'm literally experiencing what he's going on in his mind, what he's feeling. I was like, there's all these parallels, but then I keep on going out while I'm reading it, and I'm like, and so that out is where I'm like, I stop and then I write, and I'm like, oh, that's an incredible experience. And I'm not saying that everybody out there listening has to go out and write, but I would recommend writing it down, even if it's just for you.
Well, the big yeah, exactly, because the writing, once the button, it fixes it so that you won't forget.
Yeah, absolutely.
Easy to forget. Most of my life is forgotten, unfortunately. Well, not entirely, unfortunately.
Well, I think you put a big mark on the world, so I don't know about all that. So,
well, that doesn't feel like that from the inside, but one hopes eventually.
Yeah. So let's go back. What are some another? There's quite a few lessons here, but can we give some more? Before we wrap up here, some last minute things that Hemingway would want the world to know, and we talked a lot about non-physical and physical, but
yeah, I think the whole reason that he had me do this book is, I mean, the thing more than anything else is he wants people to have two things. One, a model that he himself, his life, with all its flaws, was still a model of a life of I would almost want to say completeness. He stretched so far. He wasn't just a writer. He wasn't just a sportsman. He wasn't just a hunter. Wasn't just a journalist. He had all of this. He didn't only do prize fighting. He also did classical painting. I mean, he didn't paint, but he understood it. Is what I'm saying. The range and the breadth of our potential human life is one of the lessons. But the other thing is the book itself. This book, I had to think about how to organize it, and I finally organized it in the way that it had come to me, chronologically, because the book, with my own little notes on the sides of it there, shows you the process of learning to communicate and shows what can be done and what the reader can do. Because it's reading about me, that's wonderful for me and maybe for my 6 friends in the world, but that's really not the point. What is the point is reading about my experiences as an example of what you can do. It's a roadmap. It's not even a roadmap. It's a series of suggestions. And I'm saying, if this works for you, try it. Or let it around if you think it might work for you or if you're attracted to it. The only thing I've come to say is if the idea of talking to somebody on the other side scares you, then perhaps you shouldn't do it. Perhaps there's a reason inside why you shouldn't.
Right.
It's maybe not for everybody. But other than that, if I would say to everybody, if it seems like a reasonable thing to try, if it interests you, you don't have to. Oh, and then one more thing I should say. You can't have guarantees ahead of time. I think it was Albert Einstein who said, if we knew what we were doing, they wouldn't call it research, would they? Isn't that lovely?
That's true. And it's kind of like a doctor. They're practicing medicine. They're not necessarily.
Yeah, that worries me sometimes. but that's the point. I mean, anybody who's inclined to try it, and I'm hoping some will be inclined after having seen the example, they have to remember, a thing worth doing is worth doing badly. Try it. If it doesn't work at first, maybe it's not for you, but maybe it's just a matter of you learning the ropes. You probably didn't ride a bicycle the first time you got on it, but once you got on it, you realize that conceptually it is simple. It's just you have to sort of get the knack of it. It's just a knack.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Very satisfying knack.
Yeah, and along those lines, it's like my book that I just did, my first one.
What's the name of your book, Jeremy? Let's give it a plug.
Peace Be Still.
Okay.
I was kind of going the story here because it was along the lines, and I was paralleling is that some people know this story, but I made a D in grammar in high school and a C in college. I barely made it through college with English. Now, history, math, business math, accounting, totally different story. But I really wanted to be a writer. And everybody was like, well, how are you going to be a writer if you can't even, form a sentence correctly? And then I finally one day it hit me. I was like, well, that's what editors are for.
May your tribe not increase.
and so, but what's interesting about that is I've gone through lots of challenges where I've had to, I had a small publisher in Tampa, and I had to get another editor to go back and re-edit the edits. And so I went into this level of realizing that my level of doubt, because I didn't think I was a good writer based on grammar, and as a result, now my grammar's actually improving.
Sure, it would be if you're paying attention to it.
Yeah, and so I had this mindset, and then I manifested this area where I had to go back in and re-edit it with another editor, and I had another editor doing that. So my guess that my message out there is kind of along the lines of what we're saying is like just keep on going towards something, and you don't know if that's going to turn you off into another realm. I could have wrote this book, and then as a result, it takes me somewhere else, and I didn't realize that's.
That's right. Or somebody could start off writing a book, realize they don't really want to write a book, they want to do something else, but it was the starting writing the book that got them to the realization.
Right, because they leave. It's like the universe leaves us breadcrumbs down the rabbit hole.
It is down the rabbit hole. You've noticed that, huh? Okay.
Yeah.
When I was an editor, I used to say, your job is to tell me what you know. My job is to take care of the grammar and the spelling.
Yeah.
And that did free some people.
Yeah.
I can tell them, okay, this book's not organized right. It needs to be this way or the other way. It'll read better this way or whatever. But they're the ones that have the story. Everybody out there, anybody who's listening to this, you're the only person who understands your life in the way that you do from the inside.
Right.
That doesn't mean you know what you're doing. I mean, you're probably just like the rest of us.
Well, I think that's what people are looking. That's what people are looking for is your story from the inside.
Sure, because that's all we really have to give each other is our stories.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Frank, how do they get the book? Is it on Amazon? Is it? Amazon
is one. Square One Publishers is another.
Okay.
SquareOnePublishers.com, I think. They could also go to RainbowRidge.com, RainbowRidgeBooks.com.
Okay.
And one of those will get them to them.
All right, perfect. Is there a way that they can contact you, or is it just right through the publishers and stuff like that?
Anybody who wants to contact me, I'll be glad to do that. I didn't publish the book though, so I don't have the books to sell.
All right, okay.
I have a few. I could sign them and sell them or something like that.
Okay.
If they want to contact me, it's muddytracks, all one word, .com.
Okay.
Wait a minute, that's not right. Muddytracks@earthlink.net is what I mean to say.
Okay. Perfect. Well, Frank, I really appreciate you being back on the show, and I enjoy the next project that you do. And
I'm not going to promise the next project.
All right, we'll just hold on 1 second. And then, thank you guys for listening. And thank you guys for listening today on Soul Talk. I really appreciate your time to listen, and I hope you enjoyed this amazing interview with Frank DeMarco. It's always a pleasure to speak with him, and his knowledge and wisdom is definitely evident in the way he talks and the charisma and energy that he puts off. So, again, thank you for listening to Soul Talk. And again, if you ever check out the website, it's soultalk.org. You'll get more information about the show there. So have a wonderful, wonderful day and a happy holidays.